I have your perfect beach read, beach optional, and that is The Summer Storms by Sarah MacLean, the first contemporary from one of my personal favorite historical romance authors. But don't worry, if you are not familiar with Sarah MacLean's historical romance backlist, this is a perfect place to start, while also paying enough homage and giving enough little treats to her long-standing readers to really feel like a familiar MacLean title, while also exploring a lot of the same themes she is interested in exploring in her historical romance. And this follows Alice Storm, who is returning to Rhode Island after the death of her father. But this is complicated by not only the fact that her father was essentially like a Steve Jobs-esque figure, this massive billionaire behind a lot of technology within the world of this book, but also that notably she and her father, and subsequently because of that, the rest of her family, had a very public falling out years ago, and she was essentially disowned. But now, in wake of her father's sudden and accidental passing, she is being summoned home. And on her way home, via Amtrak, she stumbles across a quieter and stern man with a dry wit, who she decides to have a one-night stand with as a kind of a last grasp of control over her life, and just because he's really attractive and it's a good time. And she slips out the next morning, as you do, toward a gothic Gilded Age mansion, and many, if not all, of the ghosts of her past, only to discover that her father has left behind an elaborate inheritance game. And not only has he left behind an elaborate inheritance game, but this game is being administered by the one-night stand from last night. You know, typical Sarah MacLean stuff. But before we dive all the way in, hi, my name is Melody, and we talk about books and book-adjacent things on this channel. Ideally, every Friday, we are diving deeper into a specific book. Ideally is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, especially this year, but if that sounds of interest to you, I would love for you to like and subscribe and hang out a little longer. But back to the inheritance game and, of course, the sexy one-night stand. Alice, our protagonist, a very Gilded Age-esque historical name that is very comfortable as a long-standing Sarah MacLean reader, is now essentially stuck on this island with her incredibly toxic mother, Elizabeth, and her three siblings, Greta, the oldest, Sam, the next oldest, and Emily, the baby, as they are vying for this inheritance. But the catch is they have all been given, except for Alice, a letter from their father, which includes tasks for them to complete in order to receive their inheritance. Alice receives a task, but not a letter, and her task is simply to stay on the island for the entire week. And all of them have to complete their tasks in order for any of them to get their inheritance. And so everyone on the island has an extremely vested interest in Alice staying put, to a toxic level at times, especially as Alice is battling with the fact that her family only cares about her staying because of this inheritance. And it's this real dramatic irony of a flip of the last time she was on the island, where she was waiting for any member of her family to fight for her to stay. Now they're fighting for her to stay, but for their own benefit. And they all have incredible stakes as well, and each sibling gets a point of view chapter strategically placed throughout the book. So starting with Greta as the game is kind of introduced, and then Sam in the middle, and Emily at the end and the climax of everything. And it offers this real depth of perspective to what every sibling has potentially sacrificed or what they're bringing to the table. And even from the most unsympathetic characters, I'm looking at you, Sam, it made me feel for him in some ways at the same time. And it's also notable because while this is a third-person narrative, we do, of course, have our protagonists and the characters we're following, and so those point of view chapters are still in that third person. But notably different from MacLean's previous work is that Jack, our love interest for Alice, does not get a point of view, which makes sense because it's not a romance novel, even if the romance is still incredibly central. And as Sarah herself said at the book event I went to for these summer storms, I'm Sarah MacLean, he's gonna eat. So we do have this really nice balance of what is familiar to longstanding Sarah MacLean readers. And I actually really appreciated the New York Times review of this book, if you have not read it, because I thought it was a great introduction to new readers to Sarah MacLean, but it also demonstrated a familiarity and a respect for MacLean's prior work in a way that we sometimes see with authors who have historically written genre fiction, especially with romance. When they switch to a title that may have more kind of broad or mass appeal, we see this tendency sometimes to frame it within the context of the previous work in a way that sets it apart or tries to say it is better in some way. Here, I think the truth is, and I think that the spirit of the review mentioned, is that this is just a different iteration of Sarah, and one that might appeal to a broader reading base, but doesn't alienate the fans that have been there the whole time. In fact, I think it's very sneaky because it throws in this kind of quintessential Sarah MacLean romance with this very strong, borderline, if not full-on rebellious heroine, and a hero who is very powerful in his own right within his own domain, and maybe somewhat taciturn, but will also burn the entire world down for his love interest. And we do see some very satisfyingly placed punches in this book in particular, but this is kind of deceptive in some ways because it's very much a driver of the book. It's very central in the story and to the book. It is a very prominent B-plot, but it is also a book that is focused on this really complex and toxic family dynamic and is looking at this possibility of reconciliation. And it's also having these larger conversations about wealth in a lot of ways, and in ways that I think we see carry over, especially from MacLean's historical romance work, especially as we've watched the kind of trajectory of that work and what it means to kind of balance wealth and power and how we operate within the world, especially following a character who has thrown that all away based on her own moral compass, Jack's compass tattoo notwithstanding. And even within the kind of explorations of her romance, there is a line here within the context of the romance in this book, but I think is very central to a lot of MacLean's plots and is what is so satisfying about her romances, is the line, "It felt good being known." And so this book is really exploring this idea of being known, and Alice thirsts so desperately to be known by her family and to be seen by her family, as well as throwing Jack into the mix. But the family dynamics here were a kind of surprise to me, in the sense that it's not that I didn't trust Sarah MacLean to make it dynamic and to have me invested in this journey. Rather, I wasn't expecting to have the depth of emotional reaction to it that I did. Now, I have not been disowned, and there are things that are not my story to tell, but I really resonated with a lot of Alice's feelings of being kind of cast aside so easily, and this real tension with knowing that others still have this relationship that is not available to you. And while Alice's relationship with all of her siblings are really impacted by this disownment, and she kind of loses her entire family in one fell swoop, it is a complex thing. And it would feel so easy to say that the stakes are purely monetary in a situation like this, but really at the heart of this is the relationships, especially as all of the tasks kind of left to the children really get to the heart of that emotional depth, or like the emotional wound. And sure, some of this is just psychotic billionaire mind games, or could be interpreted that way, but it makes the emotional stakes just as high as the financial stakes, and the fact that the emotional and the financial are so closely intertwined, and it explores what sacrifices many members of the family have made in either pursuit of the kind of cohesion and keeping of the family and keeping peace within the family, especially when we're looking at someone like Greta as the oldest and the kind of peacekeeper in that way. And as an oldest, I could both see a little bit of myself in Greta and also not at the same time, which was very interesting when we think about kind of the dynamics of our positions within family structures. But also it just makes everything feel a little bit more grounded, even amidst this kind of larger than life conceit. And then we have this setting that is primed to reflect the kind of emotional inner turmoil of everything. We have the remoteness of this private island that keeps these characters physically trapped, which forces them to face these emotions and play out. So there is that immediacy that immediately raises the stakes. I was thinking of that from a very dramatic angle, like if we were putting this on stage or in a movie, that would play very well because it's not necessarily like the bottle episode kind of thing, but it's this very similar thing where you've got this very close proximity, locking people in pantries. We also have this play on storm, which at first would feel very obvious and kind of trite, but it's leaned into just enough to make us as readers feel like we're in on the joke and the obvious symbolism of it. And so it's played really expertly in that we have Storm as their last name, which plays into the title, of course, but then we also have the storms that are ravaging this island or rolling in on this island as the moods and the circumstances of these characters change, and how it reflects the inner life of a lot of these characters, especially as we see a storm at the climax of the book. But also, amidst all of this emotional turmoil, we have MacLean's really signature wit that helps kind of ground everything or balance everything so it also doesn't start to feel overwrought. One thing I picked up stylistically here that at least I don't recall as much from her historicals, and I could be completely off base here and just wasn't registering it as actively when I was reading, but it felt like there were more kind of parenthetical asides here than I remember from the historicals, which helped with that kind of levity. And then in terms of the setting as well, we have this Gothic Gilded Age mansion. And I was very interested in hearing Sarah talk about it in relation to the Gothic of it, because it didn't, end up feeling like a Gothic, but it definitely felt like this looming presence and the history that was there as well. And we have Alice, our protagonist, who lives, or her bedroom is in the tower of this Gothic mansion, and this idea that she is the closest to these storms. And so there's a lot at play there, as well as the kind of juxtaposition that is embodied in the house with the old Gilded Age bones, with a kind of very modern study thrown on. And that also is kind of reflective of the family dynamic, as well as Elizabeth, Alice's mother, comes from old New England money and is one of the old New England families, and this idea of old and new money that is still kind of playing out in the modern day, and this idea of being kind of like as close to American aristocracy as you can get, as well as she says on page 11, robber barons would robber baron. And I will admit that all of this talk and kind of like references to Gilded Age throwbacks that were occasionally peppered through the text had me very intrigued by the idea of Sarah MacLean writing Gilded Age historicals. I love Joanna Shoup's Gilded Age historicals, and I would be very interested to see what take Sarah would have on that time period as well. She does throw in one, at least, nod to her historical romance fans later in the book that honestly had me full out squealing and maybe crying a little bit, because I was just so delighted, and it was at like the emotional climax of the book, and it was just a nice little moment kind of thrown in, this recognition, and based on where it was placed at this kind of like emotional moment where it doesn't detract from the full weight of it if you don't have that context, but if you do, it's this extra kind of bolster, and it feels like a recognition and a nod to what has come before and to that history as a readership that was really satisfying, as well as establishing this book within the larger Sarah MacLean universe, and that it all seemingly takes place within the same universe. I also found myself interested in the siblings way more than I anticipated being. I anticipated being interested in them mainly as a foil to Alice, which sure, at the kind of grand level, yes, that's exactly the case. But I do think that there was a really interesting depth to them, and I did think it was a very smart decision to give us chapters from their perspective to see what they were fighting for. And I think it gave them a really important emotional depth and made us a little bit more invested in them, which was also fun toward the climax, especially when we're watching Jack and Alice kind of banter with each other, because there is a lot of back and forth in terms of Alice wondering if she can trust him, which is understandable. He is her father's, or was her father's, fixer, and she has real questions about his loyalty and what he is getting out of this weekend and what he knew and when, because he knows more than she does at certain points of the book, and what that means for this potentially budding relationship, and getting to watch all of that play out, but only from Alice's point of view. However, something that we did get in this go around was the Storm siblings, at least in one scene, kind of offering peanut gallery commentary, which did seem like the commentary running through my own head as a reader of the Sarah MacLean novel. But the sibling I found myself, I feel like, the most interested in, unexpectedly, was Sam. And I didn't necessarily like him or agree with him, but I thought his arc was very interesting, and I also, somewhat spoilery, except I'm going to unpack it a little bit from my own reading experience. But if you want to go in completely blind, I'm not going to spoil like any big things, but I'm going to talk arcs that may feel spoilery. So just for your own safety. At the talk that I went to with Sarah MacLean, we talked about this idea of the happily ever after in this book, right? Because mostly the audience was fellow romance readers and longtime Sarah MacLean readers. And so there was a question of, are we getting a happily ever after in this book? And is the presence of a happily ever after a spoiler? And Sarah very confidently said, yes, we do get a happily ever after, and no, that is not a spoiler. However, she did caveat that not every character gets a happily ever after, and she talked very specifically about Sam in context of this, very specifically in that she named Sam, not that she talked about his ending. And so I was reading with that kind of framework in mind. And Sam is very early on kind of set up as this very entitled rich boy who is used to getting whatever he wants and works at his father's company with this title he hasn't earned. He's really resentful of Jack's presence and jealous of Jack, especially as he thinks that his father likes Jack more, but he still also expects, and his awful wife expects, him to be given the CEO title now that his father has passed. And then it's very satisfying that as part of his tasks, he's asked to do manual labor, and that on odd hours, he is not allowed to speak at all, though he finds loopholes to that I personally think should have been disqualifying for the game, but I wasn't running the game, so I guess it's none of my business. But I found it very interesting in context of his ending. One, I do think that his chapter humanized him a little bit. I mean, he's a character, he's human, I get it. I still don't necessarily like him, but I do think it's interesting. One, he saw a lot of character growth, but two, I think that I have a different read on his ending, and it's not a happily ever after by any means, but I do think that what Sam thought of as his happy ending, or what he wanted out of everything, wasn't going to fulfill him in the way that he thought. It would have just continued the cycle and the road as he had already been traveling down, which is very comfortable for a rich white man used to being handed everything. However, in many ways, I do think his ending was happier than it was framed, in the sense of what it represents and what is possible after that ending. And so I would be interested to hear your interpretation of that if you've read this book. But at the same time, it really was Alice and Jack that I cared about, and so it was very interesting. Alice, most importantly, obviously, because it was her story at the end of the day, but watching the kind of framing and her relationship and this kind of reconciliation with her family and this reconciliation with the past and the memory of her father was utmost. but also watching this relationship, which kind of plays into everything. Everything folds into each other very nicely. But like I said, it was very interesting not getting Jack's point of view of the relationship and kind of having to trust my instincts based on a Sarah MacLean hero. And I did kind of sit back and wonder if I would respond to the relationship differently if I didn't kind of have this long-standing relationship with Sarah MacLean characters. Like, are there archetypes that I'm used to encountering in her work that makes me approach someone like Jack differently? But I don't think so. And especially from the current kind of landscape where we are seeing a lot more romance from one person's point of view, I don't think that framing is as jarring or will be as jarring for new readers. And I really liked the way that relationship worked. There were really satisfying, steamy moments that were a great foil to everything else going on. Jack jumps off a boat after her at one point. I mean, come on. I also found the mother really interesting, and I think she's possibly the most triggering character in her inability to accept fault or wrong. And I do recognize, or thought it was interesting, especially at the climax, how the children and characters kind of reconciled with themselves what they could expect from their mother, as well as like these glimpses of understanding to her point of view, this idea that she is bearing the burden and the blame for things that their father did as well. However, she is not bearing the entire burden and blame, and so that's her own kind of faulty framing as well, and that's framing and a framework that she has set up mentally to protect herself in a lot of ways. And so she is a fascinating character, even if I find her very hard to like. And it's also fascinating and occasionally really hard to watch Greta and Emily especially still really striving for her approval amidst all of this. And so, excuse the pun, but we really have the perfect storm in this book of this really dynamic family drama, this intense cultural commentary with a really steamy romance that all combines and works together in a really, really satisfying way that plays on MacLean's voice and the work that she has done before and fits within that world while also presenting something new. And so, dare I say it, at the event I went to, she mentioned offhand Jane Ann Krentz in relation to a conversation they'd had on Fated Mates with Jane Ann Krentz as a giant of the romance industry. And I have talked about Jane Ann Krentz on this channel, especially as I loved her Arcane Society novels when I was growing up in the 2000s, and her ability to write under different pen names in different time periods, with Amanda Quick as her historicals, Jane Ann Krentz as her contemporary romantic thrillers, and then Jane Castle as her futuristic sci-fi, which I didn't really read as much, but did take place in the same universe. And so when Sarah MacLean announced this project, I said, well, if Jane Ann Krentz can do it, so can Sarah MacLean. And especially with Sarah's assurance that she is going back to historical romance as well and not leaving that behind by any means, it does feel like a milestone and a big moment in her career. And I'm hoping it will find a larger readership that maybe haven't considered historical romance or don't like historical romance. Listen, it's not me, it could never be me, but I do recognize that there are people that don't like historical romance. But if you liked the dynamics, especially the romance dynamics in this book, and you have never given Sarah MacLean's historicals a try, I absolutely need you to pick them up. And maybe because they were my first introduction to Sarah MacLean and for no other reason, you might start with the Rules of Scoundrels series. So listen, there's a lot of depth to this book. It's an easy, propulsive read. It is chock full of family drama and rich people problems and sexual tension that could probably power The Private Island, and it is an absolute delight. I want the record to show I absolutely trusted Sarah MacLean, but I am very, very pleased with what her contemporary ended up being, and I really hope that you will consider picking it up. And if you have already picked it up, I would love to hear your thoughts below, especially as mine were admittedly kind of scattered, but thank you for hanging out and listening to them, scattered or not. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah, bye.